It's a great privilege to have next to me Dr. Michael Jensen. Welcome.
Hi.
Inside your program, you can see a little bit of a biography of Michael. Michael's married to Catherine and they have 4 children. And Michael recently returned from the UK where he did a doctorate on martyrdom and the self. I don't think it's very often that you meet someone who's done a doctorate on martyrdom.
Michael, it was one of those ones where if you're on the plane and someone says, is there a doctor, is there an expert in martyrdom here? You really don't, you really don't want to be in that situation.
No, not exactly. Currently Michael lectures in theology and church history at Moore Theological College just down the road in Newtown. And we're very glad that Michael's here. If you've been to some of our sessions before, today is one of those extended Q&A sessions. So what we have in mind is I'm going to open up by asking Michael 1 or 2 questions to give you a feel for the framework of the discussion, and then we welcome any comments or questions you might have. Well, we actually do prefer questions than comments, and please try to keep them succinct so that we can get through as many as possible. And there'll be a couple of people moving around with microphones, and perhaps if you could ask your question within 20 or 30 seconds, that would be great. And then we'll be all done by 10 to the hour. Well, Michael, this might be an unusual place for us to begin, but recently Christopher Hitchens, who some of you may know is a well-known English atheist, wrote an article in defence of the King James Version of the Bible, which is celebrating 400 years, I gather.
That's right.
And in this article, Christopher Hitchens says that many of the idioms, phrases that we take for granted in our language continue to echo in our language today, like eat, drink and be merry, or salt of the earth. So he argues that it's near impossible to imagine our idiom and vernacular, let alone our liturgy, without them. So Michael, do you think Christopher Hitchens is correct?
Well, in this area, he's absolutely correct. There's no doubt that not only the King James Version, but indeed the Bible as it's been transmitted to us in its English form has completely shaped our English language and literature and way of thinking. I mean, I always find it interesting that it's the sports commentators that seem to draw on the biblical images most of all. So I was listening to, does anyone listen to the Grill Team in the morning, the Triple M Buffheads show, rugby league, and they were talking about, your body is your temple. And this is a biblical phrase, right out of 1 Corinthians. It's right out of Paul, out of the King James Version, and they're still using it, of course, not knowing what they're doing. They're talking about athletes getting fit and all that. Yeah,
I think I've heard in a similar vein some sportsmen saying, or rugby league players actually, that it's better to give than to receive.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So obviously in our language it's had a place, but more broadly, I guess the question for today is, well, what would we lose without the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, Hitchens talks about the influence of little phrases like that. And in one sense, that's interesting and fun and fascinating. But it's really in the area of the kind of broad, deep concepts that the Bible introduces into the English-speaking world and indeed into the Western world and therefore to the globe.
Such as?
That the Bible really has been utterly influential and remains so even when we don't recognise it. So, for example, in the area of the way we think about political life, the kind of virtues that we want to see in our political system, equality, for instance, or justice, the notion of justice but with mercy, the notion of freedom of speech, the notion of the secular, believe it or not, the idea that there should be a secular space free from religion is actually an utterly biblical idea. So those kind of ideas, human rights, I think, is an idea that derives its sources from biblical roots. The kind of things we want for our political system, for the nation in which we live, are kind of foundationally discovered through the influence of the Bible.
Okay. So, as I said, we're sort of setting the framework for the discussion so you have a feel for the range of questions you can be putting to Michael, and I think they're quite broad today. So it's affected our language, it's affected our values.
Yeah.
But to what extent could you argue the Bible is unique? I mean, surely other religious books or other sources have influenced our society?
Well, partly it's an accident, you might say. I don't think it's an accident, of course, but it's because of the way history's worked out that the Bible's had this place this prominent place in the countries of Europe, and so therefore in Australia and the other countries that European countries have influenced. But I think it actually has, it's the form of this book, the way and the content of the particular way this book addresses people that has led to not merely it being a source book for great ideas, but to the spiritual transformation of peoples such that it has shaped our culture. So it isn't just a matter of it could have been something else. I think it's actually made a difference to a particular way of life that we enjoy. Okay.
Could you think of maybe one example of that spiritual transformation, what you mean by that?
Well, I was interested to read recently an atheist called Matthew Paris has been to Africa, and he was saying there, his article is called Africa Needs Christianity. What he was noticing there was that there's a lot of charity work going on. There's a lot of fantastic delivery of aid to the poorest parts of Africa. But what he noticed was that the people that were actually starting to help themselves and help their own communities were those who had actually been transformed by the Christian message. And so he says, he didn't say of any other religion, but he said, or any other religious book, he said, Africa needs Christianity, not just Africa needs Christian aid or government aid. It needs something more. It needs this kind of inner transformation that leads to a transformation of society.
Okay. And this presumably coming not from someone who holds that
No,
position?
absolutely. No, he thinks it's not true.
Okay.
So he's just observing the results.
Okay. So maybe, and I'll just ask Michael one more question for now, and I'd really encourage you to think of some questions in a moment. So you're arguing that the Bible has a special place, but is there a dark side as well? Surely the Bible has perhaps been the source of things which are...
Yes. I mean, I think people have claimed, because the Bible has had this special place in the cultures we're talking about, it has always been claimed as an authority for all kinds of things. So people have argued, we must admit this, people have argued for slavery from the Bible. They've claimed that the Bible supported them in this. They've claimed that white racial superiority has been found in the Bible. They've claimed that all kinds of manner of injustice is found in the Bible. I would say, however, that almost in every case, in fact, that this comes from a misreading and misuse of the Bible. We need to actually, instead of just saying, oh, you can prove anything from the Bible, that's our tendency, isn't it? Oh, you can prove slavery, you can prove being against slavery from the Bible. We need to actually look at the texts themselves and ask, what are the texts saying? Is the Bible being misused in this instance? And I think we'll find that for instance, when you go to South Africa in the 70s and 80s and you hear people arguing for the white racial superiority from the Bible, when you actually look at the way they're doing it, they are willfully and so badly misusing the Bible that it becomes laughable, in fact, I think is the case.
Okay. Well, perhaps some of those opening remarks from Michael have whetted your appetite. Are there any questions at this point from the floor? I think we have two microphones, Kay on the one side and Russ on the other.
There's one over there.
I have a suspicion that certain organisations, people in the last 2,000 years, have picked up various things from the Bible and adopted them as their own. I even suspect that other world religions have kind of quietly evolved to adopt Christian principles, so that if we dumbly look at it today, there is a similarity. All religions are the same. But I suspect that the origin is actually in the Bible, in the works and words of Jesus. Can you comment on that? Am I wrong-headed?
No, I don't think you'll be glad to know I don't think you're wrong-headed. I think there's something in what you say, though I wouldn't want to make too much of a blanket statement. I'm not an expert in other world religions. However, you're right, at this level, for example, Islam most certainly comes after Christianity and is unthinkable without Christianity, as the recent billboards have proven. You know, it's sort of it's a stepchild of Christianity, and so of course it's adopting concepts from Christianity. to some degree. The other thing is someone like Gandhi, for instance, who in his work in India sees Jesus' teachings and admires them and actually thinks that he's adopting them and using them for his particular purposes. So we do see that sort of that kind of communication of the ideas of the Bible across religious boundaries occurring in that kind of sphere. I do think what we tend to do in the West, out of our desire for a tolerant world, a world in which the religions don't fight one another, we do tend to try and make all the religions the same. And since we know Christianity the best, we tend to read the other religions in terms of Christianity. So, for example, in the 19th century, when the British were in India, they started saying, oh, Hinduism, that's a bit like Catholicism, and Buddhism is like Protestantism. They kind of made those analogies, and they just don't fit, actually. They don't fit as neatly as we think they do. So I'm always a little bit wary about saying, oh, all the religions are the same in that way. I mean, I think it's a gross simplification of how things actually work.
But perhaps just picking up on a tangent from that question, sometimes it's been expressed to me that, take one of our values, love.
Yes.
That surely that's just a universal value, that we really don't need the Bible for that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what do you think?
Well, I was actually asked this question when I was in Macedonia, of all places, visiting a friend, and I was talking to a student there who's doing a project on unconditional love, because she thinks unconditional love is the thing that universalizes humanity. That unconditional love is true of all world religions and philosophies. But I think, and as I was saying to her, this is actually not the case. Certainly before Christianity, love is a kind of not very popular virtue. For the Stoics in ancient Rome, for instance, the idea that love would be a high virtue, that you would give yourself and make yourself vulnerable in just the way that Christianity teaches that love is, that you love at cost, that you love at sacrifice as Christ did. This is a disgusting and appalling idea, really, because you're showing yourself to be weak. You're showing yourself to be vulnerable. You need to actually cut yourself up. For Buddhism too, it's worth saying that it's to reduce suffering. You kind of get rid of desire. That's axiomatic in most Buddhism. It's hard to think of a system like that really endorsing love as the prime virtue. So it's not actually the case.
So
love is as universal as that. It would only be a Christian worldview that would think it was.
Okay, so then just perhaps following on that, if we have grown up perhaps in that Christian worldview, are you arguing that we don't actually know the origin of where that value has come from? We might just take it for granted in our society.
Yeah, I do think we tend to have, particularly in the last, say, 40 years, we've lost touch with the knowledge of the source of these kind of things, these personal values and virtues and political values and virtues that we hold so dear. In fact, often we've assumed that churches and the Bible are against the kind of things we hold dear. So I think this is true of, say, equality, for instance. Equality is unthinkable, as R.H. Tawney, a British economist from the 1930s, one of the sort of leading economists of the 20th century, he said equality is unthinkable without God, without a reference point like a divine being, the kind of biblical God that you have there. You can't imagine a world in which we think human beings to be equal, because evidently they're not from our experience. You can't imagine a world where they're equal and ought to be equal without the kind of God that we meet in the Christian Bible.
Okay, thank you. Other questions from the floor? Yes, sir, there's a question there.
Michael, I hope I understood what you said earlier about secularism having a grounding in the Bible somewhere. Could you expand on that, if that's correct?
Yes, I'd love to. So I said before, just in case people didn't hear it, I said before that secularism is in fact a biblical idea. Well, it's not secularism. The notion of the secular is an idea that we get from the Bible itself. And that is that the Bible, especially at the Reformation, the period of the Reformation in the 16th century, there comes a recognition that you can't coerce people to believe, that faith comes through hearing, which is what Paul says in the book of Romans, in the letter to the Romans. He says faith comes through hearing. People won't believe unless they're persuaded to believe, unless the appeal comes to them as individuals and they respond. You can't coerce it. And so there needs to be space in which the government does not interfere in the religious world, in the matters of faith, matters of religious persuasion. There needs to be a freedom of speech for religion at that level. There also, however, that means that the governmental sphere is kept separate from the religious sphere too. That they're kind of mutually informing, mutually separate spheres. What the gospel teaches us is that authority is given to Jesus Christ. And so it's authority given to him. And so earthly rulers are given their task, which is a kind of a minimal task, to protect us from evil and to establish righteousness in our communities. And they should get on with that and not try and enforce religion, enforce faith, even what Christians would say is true faith. And so that kind of separation starts off there. It's a very sort of a prized notion amongst especially Protestant Christians, this separation of church and state, and the idea that there should be a secular sphere as well as a religious sphere.
Okay, this might be off topic, so if you don't want to answer it,
Sure.
That's okay. So could this be a point of departure with, say, Islam? Would Islam see that same distinction?
Once again, I'm not expert. I cover myself by saying I'm not expert in Islam. In one sense, it's for an Islamist, an Islamic person to say so. But yeah, there isn't that kind of clear separation in between the religious and the secular in Islamic thought. You have to remember, in Islam, there isn't a kind of notion of a church either. There's not a separate church. You are an Islamic person, and you're both a citizen and a religious person that don't have that separation. And so the state ought to be quite Islamic in that thinking. I have to say also, some Christians have thought that they ought to Christianise the state, that it would be great if we had a Christian, the Christian ideal expressed in law. But I think the best reading of the Bible is that that's not in fact the case, that faith does not come through coercion, that in the end promotes false faith. It promotes shallow and insincere faith.
Okay, good. Other questions?
Hi. Is it true that Christianity has shaped scientific thinking? Because some of the early scientists were Christian. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, not just some of the early scientists. I mean, everyone up to about the 19th century. I think the whole scientific endeavour on which we rest and which we prize so much is done in touch with the Christian church, in touch with the Christian message and in the hearing of, with the Bible open. So it's unthinkable for someone like Isaac Newton, who's a very unusual man, I have to say, a very crazy man in a lot of ways, but he's certainly kind of his worldview, out of which he did his science, was also given to him. He got that from his biblical worldview. There's something at the heart of this that really is important for even for scientific thinkers who don't think about the Bible having an importance, or about the notion of a God as being important for what they do. Because reading the Bible, you understand that the world is ordered. And so when that's ordered by a God, what you understand is that when you go out into the world, you can expect to find order. And you can expect to find, to have the human mind actually start to grasp this order. And that kind of thought is actually at the foundation. Without that thought, modern science, just won't get off the ground. If what you see around you is a massive warring gods or just chaos, well, you won't get very far as a scientist. But if your assumption is that there is an order, there's a connection between all the things you see, then that's the basis for the kind of scientific method that we depend on, that we delight in so much, that gives us, oncology and laptops and all the things we depend on.
Just going back to law before, when you talked about law, it's often said that a lot of Western civilization laws...
Can you wave wherever you are?
Up here?
Oh, right, yeah.
Yep. It's often said that a lot of Western civilization's law is based on the Bible. I'm just wondering, does that go beyond sort of like principles like do unto others as you would have them do unto you?
Yes.
Because it's not really based on the Ten Commandments, I don't think. But
No.
What's really behind that statement? Because I agree with the statement, but I'd be interested to know it in a bit more detail.
Yes, it would be simplistic. Often we hear the word law and we say, well, yes, our laws are based on the Bible, or have been influenced. Our legal profession has been influenced by the Bible, and so we think, oh well, go to where there are laws in the Bible. Let's look at the Ten Commandments, and that's what it is. And so you hear of judges in the United States pulling in kind of the Ten Commandments and putting them in their courthouses. And that's a very simplistic way to think about the practice of judgment in the Bible. The Bible is permeated through with the notion that we answer for what we do, and we give account for what we do. But it's also permeated with the notion that mercy is possible. That mercy is possible. So right at the heart of the Bible is an act of justice the like we've never seen before. That is an act of justice in the cross, or talking about the cross, in which a just judge, namely God, both exacts punishment, makes atonement for sins, actually kind of deals with evil, and yet makes it possible a new state of affairs, which is mercy. He makes possible mercy. It's a remarkable act, because it's not just an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. It's both taking evil seriously and dealing with it, and yet also making for a new state. Now, this is, in the West, this is what we try and do when we meet criminals in our midst. We try and say to them, you've done the wrong thing, and we're telling you you've done the wrong thing, and you need to pay for what you've done. But we also, we recognise you as a human person, and we hope for your rehabilitation, and we hope we hope to treat you with humanity and with mercy in the way we deal with you. So it's that kind of concept, I think, which is right at the heart of the way in which we deal with justice. It's kind of influenced our Western system, and it's why I think we find when Australian teenagers are caught with drugs in foreign countries and get enormously harsh sentences, we find it so hard to kind of believe that there could be such ridiculously long sentences. Because you're dealing in a different kind of worldview, I think, there. Or recently, I heard of a lady in Iran who her lover had thrown acid in her face, and she was claiming the right to throw acid in this man's face in response, and this had apparently been legislated. That's clearly not acceptable in a Christian worldview, where we have justice with mercy. Does that answer some way to answering the question? Yeah.
I think there's another question here at the front.
Yes.
One of the questions I often get from non-Christian friends is that if there's one kind of Christian Bible, why are there so many different kind of brands, if you like, of Christianity that flow off that? So, whether it be Catholic or Protestant, whether it be, evangelical or, other brands. Just wondering if you could comment on that, please.
Yeah. Just so people here at the back, the question is, if there's one Bible, why are there so many different brands? Why are there so many different kind of versions of Christianity? We clearly, in the Christian world, we live in a PC rather than Mac universe, right? It's about as funny as I get. I'm sorry.
You've had a few takes. It's okay.
Yeah. So, there's lots of different brands, and some of those are actually quite innocent and kind of they're just products of historical the way things have worked historically, so that the Christian gospel has gone to different parts of the world, and different church organisations have emerged from different parts of the world, and so they contain local colour and different cultural flavours, not deep differences at that level. But it is true, of course, that the Christian church is deeply divided, and there are different denominations and much disagreement. And I think this is not really a surprise to readers of the Bible, actually, because in the New Testament there was already the process of Christians wrestling with the truth, wrestling to try and understand how they're going to live together. And it doesn't always work very well, even in the New Testament. Even in the New Testament, there are Christians trying to kind of work together to find out what the truth is, or how they're going to live with the truth. And what the New Testament tells us in a way is that ahead of the last times, we will always, in one sense, fall short of the complete truth in a way. We'll still be sinful human beings. It's a mark of our sinfulness as Christians that we divide so bitterly. It's also a mark just of our limitedness, where we sit in time. That does not mean that we should just throw up our hands in despair. It means that we should wrestle ever more with the text that we have. And in addition, I wouldn't want to overstate the difference. And so I've seen one particular book written, it was actually a collection of Christian creeds, which took creeds from across the different denominations and statements of faith, and tried to show how similar they are, how remarkable the similarity is, how the differences, the core similarity of Christian belief is actually remarkably coherent. What Christians have got in their agreement, in one sense, is far greater than their disputes. So.
Good. Well, Michael, we've heard how you've argued that the Bible has had a profound effect on science, on the law, and really all manner of areas. What about perhaps a bit closer to home? How is our understanding of ourself or our sort of community shaped by the Bible?
Oh, well, I would... one of the remarkable things, my first degree was in English literature, and it's remarkable, even when I did that 20 years ago, how little discussion there was of the Bible's influence. As a Bible reader, I would see it all the way through the sort of English literature we're reading. One of the great things that is there to discover is how the Bible itself is influential on the kind of the way in which we think about and write novels, which go inwards and tell us about people's inner thoughts and try and give an account of someone's inner life. That starts in the sort of the early 18th century, and it starts with Christians trying to think about their own personal lives, tell their own personal stories, talk about the way in which they've been transformed. They once were lost and now were found. That kind of story. That's the Christian story, and it becomes a kind of personal story, a way of thinking about ourselves as a person in need of redemption, a person in need of change, a person who needs to emerge as the authentic person that I was made to be.
So are you saying that the whole notion of a biography or an autobiography,
yes,
and in some respects is that similar to what we call the Gospels as being...
well, not quite, because the Gospels themselves, the stories about Jesus, they don't give us actually much of his inner life. Okay. They're ancient documents, so I wouldn't want to make that. It's not there. It's not at that point that the Bible kind of gives us this. It's more when Paul starts talking to us about what we're like without God. And when Paul says, this is how the gospel's going to change you, later in the New Testament. And when Paul tells us about the need for us to repent, in other words, to realise that we're sinful and fallen before God and the need of redemption. And then when he talks about the Christian life and how that's a struggle and how we're going to need to go forward with the help of God, the help of the Holy Spirit as we work out our Christian life in the world. And that becomes the sort of source for people thinking about how human individuals work in such a way that, again, it's sort of has had put its unique imprint on the way you and I think about ourselves.
The inner man.
Yeah, and even when we're not Christian, even when we've decided that we don't believe in God, this is the case. And the science of psychology owes a lot to this kind of very notion, the whole notion that we need to think about our inner life as well as about our bodies as temples.
Okay, good. Another question from over here.
Hi, Michael. Just a simple question to this session. What would I lose without the Bible? Can you explain to me, please?
What would
I lose without the Bible? Or
what
without
would you
the Bible
lose?
read?
Do you mean...
Yeah, in a short phrase, please.
Mean what would you personally lose?
Yes. Thank you.
Well, I've said a lot of things, I suppose. What you would lose is, I think, ultimately you would lose the person of Jesus Christ without the Bible. Because that's where we encounter the person of Jesus Christ, who is the kind of he is not merely the model human being, but he tells us what human life is meant to be like. And it's him as a kind of, not merely an example for us, but certainly an example for us, who kind of just, who sort of is at the heart of what the Bible's trying to say. I mean, I think for every person in the room, whether they're a believing Christian or not, without that incredible figure, your life would be very different, strange to say, even if you're not a believer. Without this person who has had such an influence, not only on individual lives, but indeed on nations and on cultures, I think your life would be extraordinarily different. Did you want to come back? Okay, you're done.
Other questions? One at the back there.
Right back here.
Hi. So we've been talking about what impact the Bible has had on society and Western culture. What impact do you think it can continue to have? Has it finished doing its work?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Has it finished doing its work? I don't think it has. I think it continues to have this. It continues to have this influence, and will continue to do so. Whether it has this impact on Western cultures or not, that's another question. I think it will. It kind of continues to have a silent impact on Western culture. As I've said, some of our deeply cherished notions of justice, a fair go, those kind of things, they're biblical concepts, whether we recognise them or not. Now, I don't know whether people will recognise them as biblical concepts. Julia Gillard seemed to recognise that this was the case quite recently, which is interesting. It seems that a lot of Western people are not aware. There's a lack of literacy of the Bible. However, the impact that the Bible is having on countries in South America and in Africa and in Asia is extraordinary. That's where Christianity now is. And I wait to see how, I mean, even just in the last 50 years, how the Bible, now available in the languages of many people, how much of an impact that will have not only on individual lives but also on governments that need reforming, on societies that need reforming. I'll be fascinated to see how that. So I expect to see a big impact on those particular cultures and societies in the next few decades.
There's a question over here.
Just regarding science, if I was a person who didn't believe in God, would it be rationally intelligible to do science without God?
Is it rationally intelligible to do science without God? The answer is kind of yes and no. On the one hand, you don't get the full picture, in my view, unless you have God there. You don't, in the end, see the whole. You only see in part. You don't kind of have the perspective that the believer has. So there's a kind of added piece of information that it's not information. The Bible and the Christian belief doesn't give you comprehensive knowledge of everything, but it gives you an integrative piece. It gives you the integrative principle, which is the existence of God. So I do think it's a vital kind of piece of information. But because the world is made by God, and because we are made by God, I believe that that the world is there to be known by whoever it is, whether they believe in God or not. So I believe that non-Christian scientists can, of course, do remarkable science and make fabulous discoveries. And I'm not checking out when I go for my oncology, whenever that is, hopefully not, I'm not going to check out the faith credentials of the doctor. I want to see his medical credentials. And I think that's a Christian view.
It's time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir. Thanks, Russ.
Sorry, guys.
Currently, or in the past, governments were seen as providing justice and righteousness and national security, and sort of those core things. They're moving a lot beyond that now. They're sort of imposing a risk aversion. We're not allowed to take a risk these days. Do you see that as being post-Christian, or is that still a Christian type idea?
So I don't know what you mean by risk aversion.
Oh, you almost because of, say, the changes to insurances and all that sort of thing, you can't. There's all sorts of things that we can't do now that we used to be able to do. If you go, say, if you want to run an abseiling school, you've got to take out insurance and all that sort of thing. And you've got to be licensed to do this or licensed to do that or licensed to do the other. Basically, it seems to me that we're turning into a nanny state. And there's things that we're not allowed to do that we used to be able to do.
I mean, yeah, my kids don't climb trees anymore, I have to say. I mean, as we did. My wife says it's not a childhood unless you've broken a bone. And I don't think we really let our kids do that. Now, what the Bible gives us in terms of what the state should do is it tells us, as you say, that the state's job is not to kind of deliver heaven on earth. It's not to make life... it's not to tell us what the good life is. It's not to do that. It's to tell us, it's to ward off evil and restrict evil and reward good, right? Now, of course, that's very complex, and it's not just a matter of kind of providing a police force and letting us do what we like. And there are different ways of doing that are culturally appropriate in different places. It might involve democracy, hopefully. It's better off that way. It might not. It doesn't need to. I don't think the Bible tells us we have to have a democratic system. But it tells us this. It tells us that human beings are sinful, and so they need to be checked up on, all of us. We always need to accountability. And so, well, sometimes that risk aversion stuff, it does tell us, it kind of helps us to be accountable to one another. And so I'm not entirely opposed. But you're right in that we're expecting today, we're expecting the state to deliver heaven on earth, to tell us what the good life is all about. When I think the Bible is saying to us, no, that's not what the state's job is to do. So we expect laws to be telling us how to live our lives instead of just restricting evil and so on. So, yeah, that's a beginning of a response to a huge question.
So, Michael, we're going to have to sort of round this off in a moment. You've suggested that the Bible, it's reminded me a little bit kind of like that Life of Brian movie, you know, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Well, the aqueducts.
Well, exactly. You know, well, what's the Bible ever done for us? Well, nothing apart from law, science, modern psychology, understanding of self, ...
Yeah.
But so, on the assumption that many of us as adults have actually never really read the Bible,
yeah,
why would you encourage us to do so?
I would encourage you to do so partly because it's a historical exercise. You understand the culture in which you live in. You understand the kind of roots in which these great concepts came from. You'll understand what they really mean, what love at cost, what unconditional love actually means, what it really is to give thanks, what it really is to pray. But all of that aside, you know, you'll improve your literacy. But that's an accident, actually. That's a kind of byproduct. The reason I'd like you to read the Bible is because I hope for you what happens to those young men in Africa, that you're spiritually transformed by what you read. That it's not just a matter of kind of being told a few moral truths, but then in fact you're impacted at a very deep personal level, that you're shown your true nature, that you discover yourself in its pages and discover how much you need the God that Jesus Christ is speaking about. And that you understand what it is that he did in dying for us. So, I mean, that's right at the heart there. And without that core, none of the other things would have occurred. This isn't just a kind of cool novel, right, that we all read, or a self-help book, as if something like men are from Mars and women from Venus could kind of change a society. It doesn't work like that. It works to have this impact because it changed individual lives around. It just made people knew forgiveness and relationship with God in this book, from this book and through it.
Thank you very much, Michael. There is a question there from one of our speakers.
Michael, it's a big book. Where would you start?
Look,
where would you start reading?
I would start now, unlike many books, I wouldn't start necessarily at the beginning. I'd start 2/3 of the way through, and I'd start with one of the Gospels about Jesus. I don't think you can really beat starting there. You need to hear Jesus, you need to see him, and he's kind of right at the heart of this book. So the Gospel of Mark's the shortest and the raciest. The Gospel of John is the coolest it's the most kind of head-spinning, deep, profound one. And, either of those would be a great place to start. If you wanted to hear the great teachings of Jesus, you could start with the Gospel of Matthew. But I've already said too much. I've already given you 3 ways in. Well, one of those Gospels would be a great place to go.
Funny you say that, because I'd actually like to offer the 4th of the 4 Gospels that are there. In that tonight, actually, the gentleman who asked the last question, I don't think with this in mind, I'll have a word with him after if that was his intention, is starting a course in Luke's Gospel tonight, a crash course in Christianity over 5 weeks, discovering, as Michael has encouraged us to do so, what is that spiritual transformation that God offers through coming to understand who Jesus is. So it's not too late. If you want to just pull this response form out anyway, it'd be lovely if everyone could jot down a comment or two about today. If you're new with us, please do leave some contact details that we can inform you of what's coming up. You've received in your outline the coming series over 3 weeks that Al Stewart will be speaking on from the Old Testament story of Jonah. You may be familiar with the story of the whale and the prophet Jonah. If not, come along. Even if you are familiar, there may be a few unexpected truths there to discover. So that's here next week and the following 2 weeks. But we really would appreciate your feedback on today, and in particular, if you're interested, as Michael has encouraged and as the City Bible Forum encourages, to dig a bit deeper and understand the Bible better. Well, thank you, Michael, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Please join me in thanking Michael.